welcome back to another episode of With Sonar. Last episode of August, and then we are heading into September, which is the official start, I think, of peak season, we might call it. But anyways, we'll figure out that later. Anyways, glad you're joining us here today. We've got a lot to talk about today. There's hurricanes going on. We've got peak season, particularly in the produce and reefer markets, happening right now in the Midwest. We've got new data sets inside of Sonar. And it looks like ocean peak season in China finally hit, maybe finally starting to show that it was the peak, so we'll see. But we'll dive into all that. Tony, thanks for joining us. As always, glad to have you here. I know it's your favorite time of the day, favorite part of your week, to where you get to hang out with me, right?
Yeah, always, right?
Always.
I mean, get a chance to talk Sonar more in depth than what we do maybe in a carrier update every morning. So get to talk about different data sets than what we normally cover in that. So always fun to talk, branch out a little from our norm.
Yeah. And you get to hear about my amazingly accurate predictions.
We'll put a caveat on that.
If you're all aware, I've been making the prediction for a while now that spot rates are going to be higher than contract rates by the end of the year.
That is bold.
And Tony doesn't believe me. He thinks that I got my head in the clouds, put it politely. So we'll see. There's plenty of time left. Tender rejections are on the rise.
They are.
I mean, be due to a temporary event, but, you know, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of them is completely, I think it's, everybody would think hurricane causes this, but the increase in tender rejections is being driven by reefer.
It is.
And a far away from where any hurricane is going to affect the market.
Very far. So if you haven't been paying attention, right? So reefer tender rejections, if you're not familiar with the trucking, reefer stands for temperature-controlled trailers. We've had a massive surge in reefer tender rejections in the Midwest. When we say Midwest, what are we talking about here?
We're talking, I mean, the big markets to think about in this are up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, so upper Midwest. We're talking
So
Midwest
like Twin Falls,
Minneapolis, yeah, Milwaukee, Green Bay's up there. There's, for an area as small as Green Bay, they do actually move some freight out of the market. But then you also have Chicago right there too, right? And markets and areas surrounding Chicago that produce freight. So it's not just, everybody thinks of just Chicago, but in the Midwest, especially that upper Midwest, there's quite a bit of freight that moves out of that area.
Now, when we think of produce, I think, the common thing is to think about, or when you think of reefer, you typically think of produce. But, like, what are the common commodities that they're shipping? I think we think of cheese a lot, particularly coming out of Green Bay. What are the other hot topics?
I mean, there's that. Dairy
a lot
in general, right? Then, I mean, you think about it, like Milwaukee, right? What's their baseball team's nickname? The Brewers, right? So, I mean, you do have some beer that moves out of there, right? I mean, that's what you see in Denver too, right? A lot of what comes out of Denver is beer. Yeah. And so when you think about the Midwest, I mean, seeing these markets tighten, it's interesting, especially right now. And I say that from a perspective of the market was very, I don't say boring, but like it wasn't showing any real signs of life. And then all of a sudden, things just, I mean, the region as a whole just ratcheted tighter. I mean, I was looking at it just now as a region as a whole in the Midwest. Reefer rejection rates are up like, 10 percentage points in the past month?
That's a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, you're talking dramatically tighter conditions than where they were. I mean, it was enough to you're talking moving the national average, which we have a chart of, moving the national average from 5 or 6%, 4 or 5% in the early parts of August to over 9%, by far the highest we've had at any point this year. So I mean, you're talking a massive surge in reefer rejection rates in a very, very, very short amount of time.
Yeah.
That puts upward pressure on rates.
It does. Yeah, there it is right there on the screen. So you've got reefer tender rejection. I mean, that right there, that looks like my stock portfolio in my dreams.
Yeah.
So it looks great right there. I mean, going from 3% was it in mid-July, late July, to where we are now, almost 10%.
Yeah.
Big swing. And most of that, too, happen in the last week.
Yeah, and that, when you look at the overall rejection rate, which is
for the
moving
entire
higher.
US.
So if you're looking at OTRI itself, right? So van, reefer, flatbed on a national level, this is pulling that number up, because if you broke this down by van has actually declined slightly. I mean, it's flat to down, or it's flat to down. I mean, it's right at like 3.6%. So looking at this, I mean, they are two very markets that are acting very differently in the current moment.
What's crazy too is like it's not on the screen in front of you. I just pulled it up on my computer here in Sonar. Is reefer tender rejections in Minnesota as a whole right now? We're at in August. So August 1st, we're at 2.1%. August 1st. Today, 47.3, meaning 50% of all loads being offered, being tendered out right now, are being declined, likely going through the routing guide, a lot probably showing up in the spot market right now. Not a bad place. So that's outbound. So originating somewhere in Minnesota, shipping out.
Yeah, and now if you were to say, okay, volume levels have increased too. Some of that is due to rejection rates increasing at the rate they have, right? Your routing guide starts to fail and things have to be retendered, and it boosts that volume out of the market. But I mean, something's happening in the Midwest, right? Capacity is definitely getting tighter as on the reefer side, right?
Yeah.
I think that is the key to remember is when we're talking about this in particular, it is on the reefer side. If you were to look at what dry van rejection rates we're doing in Minnesota, I mean, you're probably looking, 5.64%. So still,
as opposed to 5% last week. So a 0.5% change.
Yeah, you're not seeing quite the dramatic increases.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a concern overall when you think about it. And reefer carriers are going to benefit if they're up there. I mean, if they can find the volume, they have the ability to push rates higher.
I want to call out too, I just put it up on the chart. Man, I wish you guys could see my chart live right now. It's amazing. But so reefer tender rejections out of Minnesota right now are at their highest point that they've been since January 1st, 2022. I mean, like it's literally the highest point it's been in the last 18 months. And that was around the holiday. Prior to that, the last time it was this high was actually right around this time, late July, August of 2021.
Yeah.
Right in the height of COVID. So, I mean, you're basically back at 2021 COVID levels around this time. Still off the peak. There was some higher peaks that we saw in early 2021, late 2020, but nonetheless, I mean, you're not far off.
Yeah, and just being able to see the screen, what you're seeing is the fact that this is a seasonal trend, right? Rejection rates move up in this July and August period in Minnesota. It almost feels a little late compared to where it was, but the increase is more extreme than it's been, right? So instead of going from, hey, the market's tightening up slowly, just slowly ratcheting a little tighter, right now it's an explosion. I mean, it has gone from easy to find capacity to extremely difficult with the snap of the fingers. And that's what shippers need to pay attention to, right?
It is
because
what they need to pay attention to.
You need to be, the markets can change in such a rapid fashion that you need to be able to plan for changes like this. It's hard to do, but if you were not ready for it's not the right word, but like if you were thinking, hey, the market's going to turn at some point, like we need to have a plan in place for when the market does turn, you can react and you're not going to be on the back foot and you're not going to risk your routing guide failing in this time.
I think that's a really good call out. The other thing I also want to look at too is I'm looking at reefer spot rates right now out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we're seeing, some of these short hauls here haven't changed a whole lot. Like going to Chicago hasn't changed much. Like if we're going to, let's just say Atlanta, a little bit of a longer haul, for example. Again, not a huge movement. We're starting to see some upward pressure on it going out to some of those areas. And I think we're probably not going to see the same level of increase that we saw back during COVID. So I pulled up the chart. Reefer tender rejections actually reached the level that they're at now out of Minnesota. So in the high 40s, low 50s, back in 2019 around this time.
Yep.
And actually held that level through some of the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. but rates weren't nearly as high then as they were during COVID. And I think part of the reason is that those tender rejections, they're isolated there right now.
Yes.
So while capacity is very tight in those areas, other trucks can go there to help out and assist. So there will probably be some more upward pressure on spot rates, yes. But during COVID, while those areas were seasonally elevated, so was everywhere else around. So not as many trucks had to go to those areas for those high rates.
Exactly. Market's still, right now, I mean, market's still oversupplied. And I think some of it is, and you don't have this yet, and it's one of the things that does tighten that market, or those markets, especially in those, like you were saying, through the holidays, is that protect from freeze that, hey, we got to have a reefer unit on it.
Yeah.
Right now, I mean, you've got hot weather coming out of there. Hey, this stuff can't get over X temperature. You do have some of those as well in that area, that it's not necessarily the temperature control there is to keep it at an ambient temperature that's both not too hot and not too cold. And that's the key, right? Like there's certain things that if you leave it at, if it's 60 degrees outside, it could probably go in a dry van and be fine. If it's 80 degrees, if it's 80 degrees, well, now you run a risk of that melting, and guess what? That's a claim you don't want to have to deal with.
Very expensive. Very good. So anyways, quick summary there. Reefer tender rejections out of the Midwest are really starting to pop off. They're hitting their seasonal highs. Great time to be there if you're a reefer carrier. Don't expect the same highs on rates that you saw during COVID, but do expect some elevated rates from where you have been traditionally. Now, Tony, we need to talk about a new data set that's from Sonar. Brand new data set. You highlighted it in the Daily Watch today.
Yes.
And it's a carrier detail, and we're going to be talking about authorities, number of authorities in the market. We're going to talk about changes in authorities, all that stuff. There's one right here. So this is actually a chart that I tweeted out on Twitter, now X, whatever we call it now, and that truckload authorities, total trucking authorities in the United States hit the trend that we were supposed to see by 2030. They basically hit the levels we were supposed to be at in 2030, assuming the trend that we were on since 2010.
It's insane.
Right? So they're up 138% since 2010. But again, look at that trend line there. I just drew the trend line starting from 2010, which is when we have data back to on this. And it's, well, a little overextended.
Just a little, right? And shouldn't be a surprise if you look at rejection rates, right? I mean, we're talking 4%.
Right.
And so...
Tony, can you, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want people to understand here, like, what is a trucking authority? How is it measured? Like, when we're talking about it on this chart, what does it mean?
Yeah, so when you think about it, an MC number you can get from the FMCSA, you can keep that forever, right? You just pay a fee. To have an active authority, you have to have insurance. So this is the number of trucking firms, so the number of companies that have an MC number, so owner, operator, those, yeah, exactly. That they're counted, they're essentially equal in this case, right? Because they're each add up to one authority.
So is it fair to assume that this number is maybe biased towards smaller trucking companies?
Well, I think the trucking market as a whole is because you think about the barriers to entry.
But I mean, like that big surge that we see.
Oh, yeah,
there, right?
it's from new entrants entering the market.
Which are mostly your small carriers.
You're talking sub-10 truck fleets entering the market. So your mom and pop shops, those with a few trucks that are out there, the ones that play in the spot market are those carriers that come in because they hear stories, and Donnie Gilbert talked about this on this morning's FreightWaves Now. They hear stories about how some guy or how one of their friends made $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year in 2021 in the trucking market, playing the spot market. They go out, buy a truck, you take it to the bank, you try to get the loan out. It's a lot easier to get a loan on a truck than it is, say, a business idea, right? Trying to fund that. Securing the capital is a little easier because you have an asset, right? It's not something in your brain. And so you see everybody surge into the market to play the spot market because they're chasing high rates. What's that do? Floods the market, as you can see, as we surge past that trend line that we've been on for what, 10 years?
Yeah.
I mean, a 10-year trend line, those typically hold up pretty well. And then you see it explode like that. It's like, there's going to have to be a correction, and it's starting to correct.
And this is
I think the talking point is what we were expecting was a faster churn of capacity, and you just haven't seen it, or it hasn't been felt in the market, right? I mean, we've talked about rejection rates being at sub 5%, since this time last year? I mean,
a long time.
Yeah, you're talking 12 months, and it doesn't feel like
much longer than 2019. It wasn't that bad in 2019.
Yeah, and I mean that was the worst year on record, right? For bankruptcies, and we just haven't seen that exodus that we thought we would see. And I think our next chart will show that we're losing that capacity. The capacity is leaving the market, right? So this is the net change in trucking authority. So there's new entrants coming into the market at all times.
Right.
But this takes the number of new entrants and those revocations, so those that are letting insurance lapse, that are filing bankruptcy, all of those, and it's creating the delta, right? The net. Zero would be, hey, there's the same number of entrants.
As exits.
Yeah, so in this chart, anything in green is where you're seeing net growth versus the red where you're seeing a net loss of capacity. Now, with that said, look at how big that growth was.
Big.
Right, in comparison, right? We're talking at 545 net trucking authorities lost in the last week, right? This weekly number. But I mean, at the peak, you're talking what? 1,500, 1,000 net growth each week. So, I mean, you're talking half of what you were adding, you're taking out of a market. So,
yeah.
This chart is the one that, to me, that seems like, hey, we still have so far to go for capacity to leave the market to balance this market out, that this puts this is the chart, I think, that puts your belief that spot rates are going to be higher than contract rates into jeopardy. Because if it was moving faster like it was at the beginning of the year, I would think maybe you have a case, but it's just not moving at a pace that...
Doesn't take long, folks.
I mean, you know the difference in, it's like 90 or 80 or 90 stints still between spot and contract rates.
Yeah, I'm not worried about it. You worried about it? I'm not worried about it. I'm going to be right. Tony's going to be asking me, Luke, how did you know? What I do want to call out before we get back to my outlandish claims is on that chart, we're going to bring that back up. There it is. So this is the 5-year chart. Look at 2019.
Yeah.
There's only a little bit of red.
Yeah.
Right?
And one of those was highlighted by Celadon going out, right?
Now, to be fair, the green was very suppressed as well. So it wasn't like we gained a ton of entrants in 2019 either. So, like, it was a very muted year.
Yeah.
It's been mostly near zero the whole time, but not as much red as I think we would
not as much as you would expect. And I think...
For obvious reasons, less entrants.
Yeah. So less entrants. I mean, you're talking net, right? Remember that. So you're adding capacity at all times to some extent, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why you see now the good news is total authorities is coming down, and you see that. But I mean, like I said, you pull up the chart before this one, there's still a long way to go to get back to the level that was on that trend line. And I think that's again, the concern is that it's just not been as fast as it's needed to be. And again, tender rejections show it great. I mean, look at it where they're at. They're at 4%, and they've been there 4 or 5%. They've been there for a year. I mean, even around the holidays, what did they peak at last year? Like 6, 7? I mean, you're talking the peak season, or the tightest the market would get in any year. You're talking 6-7% rejection rates. Like, it just doesn't seem feasible. But then you look at it, and it is. And what's interesting is you're not seeing rejection rates outside of the reefer market, so the van, react to this holiday, right? That was what you were looking for. We have Labor Day coming up this next week, right? And lead times are, almost 3 days at this point. So you're talking booking freight in advance. You would think you'd see rejection rates maybe starting to pick up a little steam right now going into the weekend, considering it's Wednesday, but it really hasn't shown any uptick.
That's true. It hasn't.
So.
I am curious too, though, if the peak season that we saw coming from China to the U.S., when those goods finally start to hit the the markets, if that'll play an impact at all. Let's go ahead and pull up that chart. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit, right? So we are starting to see trucking authorities exit the market at an increasing rate. Still a long way to go, so we'll keep you updated there as time goes on and see where that changes or trends. But this chart right here is an interesting one. So this looks at ocean TEU volumes from China to the U.S., right? So our biggest trade partner on the ocean side right now, third biggest trade partner in total behind Canada and Mexico. So this chart right here does an excellent job of, I think, displaying how much of a peak season we actually had for China. Now, it looks like it may have peaked.
Yeah, it's moved down in the last 5 days.
It's moved down a little bit in the last few days, which is kind of expected for this time. So if you look at, some of those charts, some of the other peaks were around that July, August period, right? Go back to 2020, it was just a little more exasperated. Same thing, July, and then it typically dipped. Sometimes it had another little bump at the very end of the year, which we saw in 2019, and we also saw that in 2022. So we might see another dip. So I think what's really going to be key here is how far does this dip, and do we get like a second blip in late Q4? If we do, it could be good. The one thing that does keep me bullish here, though, is that this peak season that we saw, kind of ordering all these goods. So remember, this volume here is goods being loaded on ships in China headed to the U.S., and most of them haven't hit the U.S. yet. We weren't that far off from this time, last year or this time in 2021.
Yeah, correct.
Semi-close. Now, we were suppressed quite a bit before.
Yeah.
Right? And the question is, do we fall off of this number rapidly, or do we just maybe come off of it slightly?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah, it is. And obviously China's important, but it's one trade lane. And
one trade lane.
If you look at the overall inbound ocean TEU index to the U.S., it's been declining for almost 2 weeks now. So, I mean, you're seeing maybe a slowdown in other lanes. But I'm looking at it here. I've got it pulled up. So total inbound ocean TEU volume index into the U.S. over the last 3 months has increased 9%. So you've seen growth. From China to the U.S., it's up 36% in the same time. So
China's like the reefer market here.
It's coming back, yeah. And you need it to come back, right? Yeah. It is very important to the overall market, but it's clearly not driving overall import numbers higher. And I think what's interesting is how much of this is a pull forward, because at the end of the month, you have Golden Week, which is effectively like another Lunar New Year type holiday. And it affects, it's from Sunday, October 1st through Saturday, October 7th.
We can see that on the chart there. I mean,
you can see the dips.
Right around, that September period.
The end of September, right? Or first week in October. That's what to pay attention to, is where do we go leading into that? Is this just a pull forward of demand, especially when the spot rates on the ocean really haven't been able to kind of withstand these increases? They see bumps, but it's not in a way that...
Nothing meaningful.
Yeah.
Still at 2019 levels.
Exactly. So it's fairly cheap. So maybe from a shipper's perspective, they're moving freight now, one, to ensure that it's here, right? Because you do have issues on the Panama Canal. It's not... I think Greg Miller wrote an article that says it is an issue, but it's not a crisis yet, but it could be, and I think it's something that could help boost the West Coast. So there's that. But I think overall, what you're seeing is just the peak season, at least when you look at it from a global perspective headed to the U.S., not just China to the U.S., the peak season's just muted in terms of ocean demand. Now, some of that probably has to do with inventory. Some of it still has to do with inventories, right? The big retailers have corrected that, but that doesn't mean everybody has. So, I mean, there's some interesting stuff that's going on here. Yep. And, I mean, overall, it's a positive for China to the U.S. because you need to see China pick up steam.
Sure.
But it would have been nice to see the rest of the whole overall index, that IOTI.USA, increased as well during the same time frame.
Yeah, we'll have to keep eyes on it to see what happens and where some of these other markets go to. Yep. One other highlight, I do want to make an announcement. Just remember, we're going to be talking a lot more about the freight markets in depth at our next conference, F3. It's in November. You don't want to miss tickets. I'll be there, obviously, so come hang out with me.
Yeah. With
A lot of our
Sonar, I'll be
customers
there.
With Sonar is going to be happening. I think we have at least 2 days that we're there, maybe 3, but for sure 2. And we're going to have some guest speakers there, a lot of customers. It's going to be a good time.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be some food venue, obviously food there, but like I think they're even bringing in some food trucks throughout the day that you can come visit. So it's going to be a good time.
Yeah, if you were there last year, this one is going to one-up what we did last year.
Yeah.
Thought it couldn't get better. It's going to be better just in some of our musical acts, I mean, obviously. But then also you get to see the new tech and how the tech is advanced. And some of those keynote speakers are pretty epic.
And make a lot of connections.
Yes, I think that's the big key.
Make a lot of connections, bump elbows with a lot of people in the industry. I know it probably seems like, you know, Luke and Tony is like the peak, but, you know, there are other people in the industry. But anyways, we'll see you next week live on With Sonar, and we'll keep you updated with what's happening in the freight markets. This is where you come to see the latest information. In the meantime, have a good rest of your day.